Hello, welcome to Kentish Tales and Tales of Kent, stories of the mythology, folklore and history of this quite stupendous county. So we're heading back to the 1480s for this tale. It's near the tail end of the War of the Roses. This story concerns a Henry Wyatt. He refused to acknowledge that Richard of York should be the King of England, but instead that a Henry Tudor should be King of England. Now you know these people. Richard, Duke of York, was famous for having a hunched back and for possibly killing his nephews in the Tower of London.
Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by this son of York.
Henry Tudor, of course, goes on to be Henry VII, so the dastardly Richard III had Henry Wyatt locked up in the Tower of London. And here, in Boxley Church, we find a plaque to the Wyatt family that reads, "To the memory of heir Henry Wyatt of Allington, Castle, Knight, Baronet, descendant of that ancient family who was imprisoned and tortured in the Tower in the reign of King Richard III. Legend tells that when he was in the Tower, he was put on the rack. Now, the rack was a relatively new innovation in Britain. It had been brought to England in the 1440s by the Duke of Essex, and he'd installed one in the Tower of London. From that point, the machine was known as the Duke of Essex's daughter. We don't have any examples of people writing down what they'd experienced after they'd been on the rack, which is probably unsurprising because they probably find it quite hard to write anything down. But we do have some from a William Lithgow, who was a Scottish traveller and merchant who happened to land in Malaga in the 1620s. Now, he was taken prisoner by the Spanish Inquisition. Probably didn't expect that. And he was tortured. And he said, "I was stripped to the skin and mounted on the rack. This was a vertical rack, upright against the wall, where there I was hung with two small cords. Thus being hoisted to the appointed height, my tormentor drew my legs back through their two sides of the three-planked rack, tied a cord around about each of my ankles, and then drew the cords upwards, bending forward my two knees against the two planks until the sinews of my hams burst asunder. So I hung for a large hour. Now my eyes began to start, my mouth began to foam and froth, and my teeth to chatter like a drummer's sticks. But notwithstanding my shivering lips, my groaning, the blood springing from my arms, broken sinews, hams and knees, still they struck me in the face with cudgels to stop my screams." It was said that even hot knives were applied to Henry's flesh to make him change sides to the Yorkists. Some even said that Richard III oversaw the whole procedure, torturing Henry himself. Now here's the stranger bit. When Henry was there, presumably lying near starving, freezing, almost near death, on the floor of the Tower of London, something strange happened, which is recounted on the plaque in the church. Henry, who was imprisoned and tortured in the Tower in the reign of King Richard III, kept in the dungeon, where fed and preserved by a cat. It was said that the cat would come into his cell at night and lay on his chest and keep him warm. The official family history from 1721 says that a cat came into the dungeon with him, and, as it were, offered herself unto him. He was glad of her, laid her in his bosom to warm him, and by making much of her won her love. Henry was able to get the cat to bring him pigeons. "Oh, what have we brought me here, girl? Oh, this looks very tasty. Oh, give this a bit of a plucking. Oh, very juicy. Oh, possibly good in a pie." He would then take the pigeons to the jailer, who, obviously in between torturing him and starving him, would then apparently cook them for Henry to keep him alive. Henry apparently made the pun that the jailer had become his caterer. See what he did there. Now there is a painting of this. Wonderful interspecies love affair. Prepare yourself for it. Though This painting is from the 18th century, and confusingly the artist never seems to have ever seen a cat, but never mind. Also in this point, Henry's meant to be 23. I suppose if you've been tortured, it's quite an ageing process. So there's your story. Henry Wyatt courageously stands up to a tyrannical Richard III who tortures him himself, and is only kept alive by the wonder of a kind and considerate cat. Well, here's a disappointing bit. It would appear that the Tower of London has no records of Henry Wyatt ever being kept there. The evidence seems to suggest that he'd gone to Scotland, actually, to try and secure the support of the Scottish King James III to fight against Richard III. His son Thomas wrote that God had preserved his father in prison from the hands of the tyrant that could find in his heart to see him racked from 2 years and more imprisonment in Scotland in irons and stocks. So, possibly what actually happened was he was up in Scotland and he had the misfortune to stumble across some nobles who were all for the Yorkist cause, or maybe he just found some Scots who didn't like him very much and decided to hold him to ransom. And what about the evil Richard III? Was he there, applying the screws to poor old Henry? Well, it would seem a bit unlikely he'd be travelling up to Scotland to do that. Either way, Henry VII, when he became King of England after the Battle of Bosworth, having defeated Richard III, he paid the ransom, or freed Henry Wyatt, and allowed him to go back to his lands in Kent. But what about the bit about the cat? That's what you really want to know. Was the bit about the cat true? Well, it was said that Henry was, throughout his life, after his experience in prison, always to have a cat at his side, and was always very fond of them. Everything ends quite well for dear old Henry then. He becomes owner of this castle in Allington in 1492. He also gets given Carlisle Castle and Norwich Castle, and made Protector of the Crown Jewels. He gets put on Henry VIII's Privy Council, made a Knight of the Bath, so everything goes quite well for him. Let's probably not talk about what happens to his son and his grandson, who become far more well acquainted with the Tower of London, in one case quite terminally. If you've enjoyed this tale, perhaps you'd like to like and subscribe. You might also consider looking at the reading list I've put on my website, which you will find below.